Hey, welcome to Ones and Zeros. My name's Ben, and today we're having a look at scope in C++, in relation to variables. So I'm going to sort of explain what scope is, how we would use it, and sort of different reasons why we might use it in certain situations, things like that. So let's jump into some code, and we'll take a bit of a look at it. So again, much like the other videos in our C++ series so far, we're going to be using Visual Studio just because it makes things a little bit easier. And let's take a look at what we mean by scope. So you might notice in certain situations you might have some variables that might be declared near the top of your source file. So let's call this one global variable. And we might set that to number 1. We might pop another one in here, which we're going to call local variable. And we'll make that number 2. And you might have seen in some situations, like where variables may be declared, like I said, up the top of the source file. And you may also see some that are declared inside a function like this. And you might also come across, just pop a if statement in there, and we're going to call this local variable 2, and we'll make that one equal to 3. So in these 3 situations, these 3 variables all have a slightly different scope. So starting with this top one, the reason why we've named it global variable is because it has what is known as a global scope. So it doesn't exist within a specific function. And as a result, it is accessible by anything that comes below it in the source file. So even if we were to create let's just call this function test. So we're just going to create another function down here. So we can access that particular variable within our main function or within our function test that we've created there. And I'll give you a bit of an example of that. Let's, in this function, test function that we've created, get it to print that particular global variable out to the console for us. And just to make sure it actually does that, let's call that function from our main function, like so. So what should happen here is our main will go through. It's going to run through these lines, which aren't actually going to do anything too much at the moment. It's going to run this function test, which is going to then print out our global variable. And then our cin.get is basically just here to stop the execution of our program at that point in order so that we can actually see what it shows in the console rather than it just exiting straight away. So if we run that now, I have an error here somewhere. What's it telling me is the error here. So perfect example of visibility right here is that our main function is not actually able to see this test function because it comes after the main function in the file. So it would actually need to be before the main function in order for it to be visible to the main function. However, we can just add a declaration to that up here, which then makes it visible to that one. So if we try and run that now, we shouldn't get an error. And as we can see, it outputs the number 1, which is the same number that we have stored in our global variable. Now, with these variables in here, these local variables and this one that we've popped in here, these ones can't actually be seen by our test function down here because their scope only exists within this main function, or in the case of this variable, it only exists within the scope of inside of this if statement. So for example, if we tried to put in local variable there, it's going to give us a red underline to let us know that it can't see it. And as we can see with the pop-up that we've got there, it says identify a local variable as undefined. However, if we take this bit of code here and we pop it in here, let's just comment out our call to the test function for the moment. We can see that we no longer get the red underline underneath that one in here because it can actually see that because it exists within the scope of our main function, as we can see there. Unlike this one, which only exists within the scope of this if statement. So if we try and do the same thing with this one, again, we're going to see a red underline because it can't actually see local variable 2 because it only exists in the scope of this if statement here. So for example, if we grab that and we pop that inside our if statement, we can see that that red underline goes away because it can now actually see that. And inside the if statement can also see this local variable because it is in itself inside the scope of the main function as well. And of course, it can also see the global variable that we created up the top here because that exists in the scope of everything in the file below it. Now, there's different reasons why you might actually declare variables in particular areas, typically down to the way memory is used. So in the case of these particular variables that we're declaring here, these ones are all exist within the stack memory. So you've typically got two different types of memory in your C++ program, which is going to be the stack memory and the heap memory. So your heap memory is typically going to be storing things where you're asking specifically for memory to be allocated. So things where you may be using malloc and free, or where you're using the new and delete keywords to create, say, a class or something like that. Those ones will actually be stored in heap memory. However, if you're just declaring a normal variable like we are here in these 3 examples, those are stored on what's called the stack. Now, say if rather than just declaring an int in these particular cases, we were declaring something that takes up a large amount of memory, so a large array or something like that. If we were to declare it up here, so say if we change this and we make it an array of 256 values, like so, then that's going to take up 256 times the size of int, which in this case on this computer with this compiler would be 32 bits or 4 bytes. So essentially that's going to take up a whole kilobyte. And because it's declared in a global scope, it's going to be taking up that 1 kilobyte the entire time that the program is actually running. Whereas if we have this one, and let's do the same thing here, so we'll make that an array of 256 ints, this is only going to exist in the time where this main function's actually running, which is kind of a bad example due to the fact that when we exit main, the program's finished running anyway. But say, for example, we took that one and we wanted to use that in our test function, then when the test function gets called, if we uncomment that, So as the program starts running, so it'll enter into the main function, it'll run through this stuff here, and then it's going to call our test function. When it jumps in here, then this local variable, this array of 256 values will then be created at that point. And then when we exit out of this function here and we go back to main, that 1 kilobyte of memory is then going to be freed up. So in order to make sure that we're only using memory when we need to be using it, it's a good idea to have a bit of an understanding of what scope that variable needs to be used in. So say, for example, we just went through and we declared all of the variables that we're going to be using globally, then it's going to take up all of that memory the entire time the program is running. However, say we wanted to only do something with this particular array during this test function, then if we declare this variable inside the test function, it's only going to be taking up that 1 kilobyte of memory during the time where that test function is actually running. So it'll come into existence at this point here, and then as soon as it gets to the end of the test function and jumps back to main, it's going to stop existing, and that 1 kilobyte of memory will then be freed up. Now, I'm not going to go into sort of arrays and the stack and the heap and that stuff too much during this video, because we'll go into a bit more detail with that sort of thing in future videos. But that just sort of gives you a bit of an idea of what scope is and why we might actually be declaring certain variables in certain places. So in order to make sure that you're managing memory well, it's always a good idea to only be having a particular variable in the scope that it's going to be used, especially in the case of the stuff we're doing in a bunch of our other videos where we're dealing with microcontrollers that have much more limited memory available to them than what we might have on a typical PC or Mac or something like that. So hope that makes a bit of sense and kind of sheds a little bit of light on that one. And we do have a bunch more C++ videos coming out over the coming days and weeks moving forward. Bunch of little bits and pieces that I wanted to be able to focus on. If there's any questions or anything that you would like us to focus on a little bit more, or to answer certain questions, things like that, feel free to leave a comment. Or you can always jump onto our subreddit, so r/ones and zeros, or there is also our email, onesandzeros.contact@gmail.com. So feel free to shoot us an email as well. And would love it if you followed us on Twitch or liked and subscribed on YouTube. There will also be another stream coming up fairly shortly this evening where we're going to get into a bit more stuff with the STM32 microcontrollers as well. So hope you enjoyed that. Thanks very much for watching.